So thank you so much to the Camden Public Library for hosting me tonight. I'll tell you a little bit about me to start, not too much, but I am from away. You can probably tell that from my accent. I grew up outside of Philadelphia in South Jersey. I retired to Maine about 7 years ago. I was a lawyer in a previous life. I managed to make an escape from that with some of my soul left intact. The other thing you should know about me is that I was adopted when I was just 3 or 4 years old. I say years every time, 3 or 4 days old. About a year and a half ago, I saw the one and only picture I've ever seen of my birth mother. Adoption laws and being able to find out your background, those laws have become liberalized, and adoptees like me can now get access to their original birth certificates. And I got access to mine and found out who my teenage mother was many years ago, and managed to track down just a single picture of her. It's the only one that I've ever seen. And that picture, subconsciously at least, inspired part of this story, which involves an old black and white picture. The other thing you should know is I never set out to be an author, never set out to write a book, didn't do it until I was retired. To this day, when people call me an author or they're sponsoring an author event, it sounds funny to me because I don't picture myself as an author, although I did write one book. My wife, Nancy, said to me when I was thinking about writing a novel, why don't you write about curling? And I said, that's not a bad idea. You're supposed to write what you know and what you love. And since I love curling and love Maine, I wrote a curling novel set here in the glorious mid-coast of Maine. I don't know about you folks on Zoom, but have either of you ever tried curling? No? Okay. You've seen it on TV. Yeah, everybody has seen it on TV. So I guess I have my work cut out for me in kind of explaining what all the gear is and what curling is all about. Over here are really the stars of the show: the curling stone, the curling shoes. And I will get to those in a moment. But the stone comes from Ailsa Craig, the island that's on the cover of the book. And we'll talk about Ailsa Craig a little bit in a minute. But in a nutshell, the object of the game is to slide that stone down 140 feet of ice and get it closest to what's called the house. It looks like a bullseye for those of you who have ever shot a bow and arrow. The house looks like a bullseye. You're trying to get that stone closest to the center. The book, The Stones of Ailsa Craig, is a work of historical fiction. And although it centers around curling and a lot of the characters in the book curl, it's not about curling. But that is kind of the connective tissue that holds and weaves the story together. It's simply a mystery, although everything happens in plain sight. And it's a story about one man's loss, loneliness, obsession, and quest for vengeance. As a work of historical fiction, there are two timelines going on, one in present-day Belfast, Maine, the other in 1800s Scotland, where curling was born some 5 years ago, about 5 years ago, 500 years ago. The Scots seem to have a way of inventing strange games. They invented golf and they invented curling. And the story is largely set on the island of Ailsa Craig. Ailsa Craig was a volcano 60 million years ago or so, as the supercontinent of Pangaea was breaking apart and Europe was separating from North America. Ailsa Craig was one of the volcanoes that erupted. The glaciers over the millions of years have worn it down to the relatively small size that it is now, about 2 miles in circumference, about 900 feet high. The island is home to a castle which is in ruins, was basically never used. And a now automated lighthouse, although it did have lighthouse keepers over the years. The island itself has never been inhabited. People have never lived there except for the lighthouse keepers and a few quarrymen who would come to mine the granite. The other thing about Ailsa Craig is that it used to be a breeding ground for puffins. And at one time, there were upwards of 500,000 puffins who would come there every year to breed. But that changed. I'm going to read you a passage from the book about Ailsa Craig and why the puffins encountered some problems. My newfound fiction with curling and with Ailsa Craig in particular led me to the story of the brown rats and their century of domination over animal life on the small island. In the 1860s, there were upwards of 250,000 pairs of puffins nesting and breeding on Ailsa Craig, 500,000 birds on one small island. An ornithologist once claimed that if the puffins were disturbed, they caused a bewildering darkness in the sky, furiously flapping their undersized wings. Passing ships would sometimes fire a gun to startle the birds, so that they would all alight from the island, blacken the sky, and provide amusement and wonder for the passengers and crew. By 1935, though, each and every single puffin was gone, not to return for 70 years. The birds were simply no match for the rats. The first reported rat on Ailsa Craig was a brown rat, also known as a sewer rat, wharf rat, or Norway rat, sighted in 1889 by the new lighthouse keeper, Cuddy Urquhart. However, and whenever the rats first got there, they flourished, with no predators, save for the keeper's dogs, which would not keep up with the reproductive prowess of the rats, and an unending supply of food and eggs and chicks of hundreds of thousands of birds. The rats multiplied at an astonishing rate. Keepers reported that at night, from the gallery outside of the lantern room, they could look down upon a virtual sea of brown rats scurrying about their business, their eyes glowing red from the reflected light. Brown rats, through no real fault of their own, are pretty nasty creatures. They can grow to be quite large, weighing in at a pound or more and growing to be as long as 20 inches. They can and do eat almost anything, including insects, fish, and mice, although grains and seeds typically form the bulk of their diet. One researcher concluded, apparently after exhaustive study, that their favorite foods are scrambled eggs, macaroni and cheese, raw carrots, and cooked corn. Among their least favorites are beets, which is understandable, raw carrots, and cooked corn. Among their least, if the brown rats are particularly hungry or can't find their favorite food, they will eat soap, paper, and beeswax. Brown rats will sometimes even hunt together as a pack and prey on poultry and young animals as large as baby sheep. So the rats took over. Apparently, they got there on a shipwreck and took over the island. The good news is that about 30 years ago, some scientists intervened and laced the island with poison, killing all the rats. And now, just within the past decade or so, the puffins have started coming back, and now there are 3 or 4 dozen puffins who come back every year and again use Ailsa Craig as their nesting ground. Usually what people are most interested in this presentation is the stone. The stone is made of granite that all comes from that island. When the volcano cooled, it left this particular type of granite, which is completely impervious to water penetration. So as the stone sits on the ice, it won't freeze and thaw, crack and chip and ruin the stone. And so now these stones will last 40 or 50 years, even when used regularly. Why that granite is found only on Ailsa Craig, no one seems to know. But it's the only place in the world where the granite is found. And every stone you'll see in curling competitions comes from that island. I'll talk a little bit about writing and the writing process. The book is a work of historical fiction. And what that means is an author has to do hundreds and hundreds, even thousands of hours of research because you want to get things right. So I'm reading through books and journals and curling club minutes from Scotland from the 1700s and 1800s, looking for little nuggets that will inform the story and provide detail. So much of what you will read in the book is true and historically accurate. Some is just completely made up. But the great thing about historical fiction is if you get something right and somebody points it out to you, you can say, well, that's meticulous research. I mean, I spent hundreds of hours. Of course, I got that right. But if you get something wrong, and someone is sure to point it out to you if you get something wrong, you can say, right, that's the fiction part. I made that part up. So you can't really go wrong writing historical fiction. The other thing about writing for me is it's a great opportunity to leave some Easter eggs around, Easter eggs being little parts of the book that nobody would know except for me and some of my friends. An example is the narrator's wife is named Molly. Now, I could have picked any name in the world for her, but I chose Molly because my dog is named Molly. And so I made one of the main characters in the book named Molly. There's a character, a lawyer in the book named Steve Alexander. When I was working at a law firm, I had two friends there, one named Steve Brock, one named Jeff Alexander. So I took Steve and I took Alexander and I made that character. So it's fun to leave those little nuggets. Dates in the book might be an anniversary or somebody in my family's birthday, all those kinds of things that you can leave as a trail and something that I know, but the reader doesn't necessarily know. I mentioned that the book is set partly in present-day Belfast, Maine. For those of you who know something about Belfast, Maine, you know that for most of the 1900s, it was the chicken processing capital of the world. They were processing millions of chickens a year in Belfast. In doing that, back in the day before environmental laws were very stringent, there were large drainage pipes right into the bay. The beaks, the talons, the feathers, the guts, the blood, untreated, drained right into the bay. And I'm told today that some divers have gone down there recently and have seen the floor of the bay around Belfast, just beaks and talons and chicken parts still deep in the bottom. So that's one of the true parts of the book, set in Belfast, Maine. I want to read you a story about the Broiler Festival, which was a big deal in Maine in the mid-1900s. And this, again, is true. This is part of the historical part, not the fiction part. In 1948, the city decided to hold Broiler Day, which was so successful that it inspired a second, even larger Broiler Day in 1949. The second event attracted some 2,000 people, including the governor and a host of quote-unquote celebrities from the poultry world, who together consumed 3,000 pounds of chicken barbecued over an 80-foot-long pit. A broiler queen was crowned, chosen on the basis of poise, personality, and appearance. The first broiler queen, 16-year-old Betty Perry, wasn't even from Belfast, but rather from the neighboring town of Lincolnville. Governor Frederick Payne himself placed the cardboard crown atop her head. Betty Perry later gushed that it was the most wonderful day of her life. Molly and I, again, the narrator's wife, arrived in Belfast a few decades too late to enjoy Broiler Day. Being named Broiler Queen made Betty Perry famous. It lifted her out of deep poverty, where her mother had sewn dresses for her, quite ironically, from chicken feed sacks. Her family was so poor that they used newspapers for wallpaper. After being crowned the first broiler queen, Betty Perry toured the country with the other Maine queens. And you can probably guess who they are. The potato queen, the blueberry queen, the lobster queen, and Miss Maine, although Miss Maine wasn't technically a queen. Why Susie Knight, the 1949 Maine sardine queen, did not get to tour with them is unclear, since the sardine industry was nearly as large as the lobster industry at the time. It is quite likely that Betty Perry was the first Mainer to appear on television, promoting, of course, Maine broilers. Molly stumbled across a story about the Broiler Festival and the naming of a broiler queen one time in Down East magazine, and she gave it to me to read. When I was finished, we talked a little about the festival and the article and what the city must have been like back then. Later that night, Molly looked up from her book and asked me, "Do you think that I could have been a broiler queen?" This struck me as one of those questions which was really just meant to be a conversation starter, not a serious question. So I said, "Well, you have the poise, looks, and legs for it, but I don't know about the personality part." Apparently, that was not the answer that Molly was hoping for. She called me a rather unflattering name and went back to her book. So that is the true story of Betty Perry, the first broiler queen in Maine. The other thing about doing research for historical fiction is that you find out how much times have really changed. Sensibilities have changed. And this is an example of that from 1826. This is a true newspaper account from an old newspaper in Scotland. And this part relates to curling. You'll hear the term bonspiel in this little portion. A bonspiel is just a gathering of curlers where they play a tournament. 1826. On Tuesday last, 28 blooming damsels met on Del Pedder Loch in the parish of Sanquhar to play a friendly bonspiel. They formed themselves into two rinks, and although wading up to the ankles in water, seemed to enter into the spirit of the game, and to contest it with as much intense anxiety as if the question that the losing party should all die old maids had depended upon the issue. At the conclusion of the game, neither party became victors, the number of shots having been equal. Many individuals of the other sex were attracted to the scene of action, and as the ladies, like true curlers, had resolved to adjourn to the toll house where a het pint had been ordered, they kindly invited the gentlemen to accompany them. It soon became a matter of doubt if this was of sufficient potency to counteract the bad effects resulting from wet feet, and as tea could not be expected to prove more efficacious, our heroines resorted to whiskey toddy, and through its inspiration, a dance was proposed, and the ball was kept up with great vigor until far into the wee hours of the morning. And this is where the reporter from 200 years ago changes from being a reporter to being a commentator. It may be true that there is no good reason why females should not have their hours of recreation as well as men, but it seems advisable that those recreations which they do engage in should be of a character befitting their sex. Ice playing is certainly not a game of this description. It has nothing feminine pertaining to it, either in theory or practice. If, therefore, prudence and propriety are to be consulted, the fair maidens of the lower end of Sanquhar Parish will not again resort to the same expedient for obtaining a day's relaxation and enjoyment. So the writer clearly was no fan of women going out and curling. Women who curl today might take some umbrage at that. Tara Peterson was on the 2022 Olympic team for the United States, was kind enough to write the foreword to the book, and she's one of the ones playing here on the video showing the game. So with that, I'll just mention the other pieces of equipment for those who aren't intimately familiar with curling. You see the curlers sliding down the ice on one foot. this is a curling shoe with Teflon on the bottom. As you can imagine, Teflon on ice is a pretty slippery combination. And so that shoe was used to allow the curler to slide, 40, 50, 60 feet, pushing the stone ahead of him or her. The other shoe has a rubber sole, which is for gripping on the ice so that you're not walking on two pieces of Teflon on ice, and you can do your best to keep your balance. So with that, if anyone has any questions, comments, I'm happy to entertain them about the game of curling or about the book.
Thank you. We do actually have a question on Zoom. They're asking, how has the equipment changed in the years that you wrote in the book? So I think they mean in the history of curling, has the equipment changed?
Yeah. It has changed enormously. Curling was invented 500 years ago or so in Scotland, which is why part of the book is set in Scotland. They know that because about a century ago, they drained a pond in Scotland and at the bottom found a rock which had been used as a curling stone, and it had the inscription 1511 on it. So they know that curling is at least 500 years old and was done in Scotland back then. Back in the olden days, before we figured out how to make ice indoors, the game was played outdoors on ponds and lochs and rivers, and people would simply find a stone that they liked and would use that to curl with. They wouldn't slide it along the ice necessarily. They would pick it up and sort of heave it down the ice. So some people might have 70-pound stones. Some people might have 20-pound stones. Everybody had their own. There was one in particular named Whirly, because people used to name their stones. Whirly was a triangular stone, so that if it was sitting at the target and somebody tried to knock it away, if you can imagine a round stone hitting a triangular stone, the triangular stone will spin around in place and not move, and the round stone will go ricocheting off. The powers that be in curling got together and banned triangular stones and eventually standardized them so that every stone looks like this.
And that one is 40 pounds. So they're all curling stones are 40 pounds.
All curling stones are 40 pounds and the same circumference. They're identical.
So about the granite, so nobody knows exactly why the granite from Ailsa Craig is so impervious to water.
Nobody knows. It's called blue hone granite. It is the part that slides on the ice, and it only comes from Ailsa Craig. It was left behind when the volcano cooled. Nobody knows why it's only found in that one place. But this particular granite is completely impervious to water penetration, which is obviously a great benefit to the life of the stone. It won't freeze and thaw and ruin the stone. There are some other curling stones from other places which are just not as high quality. They tend to chip or even break. This granite, nothing's going to happen to it for 40 or 50 years.
Is that granite used for anything else, or is it just used to make curling stones?
It's far too valuable for pedestrian uses like it used to be. In the past, it's been used in church buildings in Scotland for walls and for paving until somebody figured out that no, it's perfect for curling. It shouldn't be used for anything else. Yeah.
How much does a curling stone cost? What's the accessibility of this?
Fortunately, if you ever were to try curling, the club would own all the stones. I don't own this stone. It belongs to the Pine Tree Curling Club. You need 16 stones to play one game, 8 stones per side. These will cost $700-800 each. So yeah, you're talking $10,000, $12,000, $15,000 for a set of stones. You're not, you can buy used stones or you can rent stones, but buying them is an expensive proposition.
Did you have a chance to visit Ailsa Craig during the course of the weekend?
I did not. I have never been there, although I feel like I know everything there is to know about it, including the fact that some fellas were shoveling guano in one of the caves years and years ago and came across a couple of skeletons, believed to have been some smugglers who used to hide their goods on Ailsa Craig in the caves and then ship it to the mainland.
But are you planning to go?
I'm planning to go. We're hoping for a trip this spring to Scotland, and certainly would include a trip to Ailsa Craig. On that trip, 10 years ago, you could have bought the entire island had you wanted for about $2.5 million. Nobody wanted it, so it remains the property of, I guess, the Clan Kennedy in Scotland.
But there's presumably like a quarry there, for like who owns the quarry?
Two quarries. A company called Kay's Curling makes all the stones you'll see on TV in the Olympics and international competition. They have a monopoly on this. But because the entire island is now a wildlife sanctuary, they can only go there once a decade. Take as much granite as they think they'll need for curling stones for the next 10 years. And the reason for that is so as not to disturb the seals and the puffins and the other wildlife that calls the island home.
Do you know if they like airlift the granite out or they put it on a boat?
They put it on a barge. They don't even use dynamite like you would expect. They use a much less explosive way of breaking the granite. Load it onto a barge, take it to the mainland, and all these curling stones are made by Kay's Curling, handmade, hand polished. It takes a worker about an entire day to make one stone.
Oh, we have another question
Oh.
on Zoom. This person is asking, what is the process to create a curling stone? So I guess, yeah, how do they cut it? How do they polish it?
Yep. They'll take the larger chunks of granite on the barge ashore, and then they'll carefully break them into more manageable sizes, maybe 70 or 80 pounds, and machine them and hand polish them and put the insert in them, balance them, make sure they're perfectly balanced. And you have a curling stone.
I wonder how long that takes.
It takes nearly a day for one person to make a stone.
Is the handle like glued on? Or
The handle,
yeah.
there's a hole drilled through the center, and you can maybe see at the bottom, there's a little nut that holds it all in place. So the handles are interchangeable because they sometimes do break or crack, but they're only fiberglass. They're not nearly as valuable as the stone itself.
I have a question about the book. How did you decide which years you wanted to focus your story on or take place in?
Obviously, I love the mid-coast of Maine, so I decided to set it in present day here, which is what I know. So people from the Camden area will recognize a lot of the places in the book: Owl's Head, Lighthouse, the Rockland Breakwater, where the narrator unfortunately loses his hat, Owl and Turtle Bookshop, set all along the mid-coast and primarily in Belfast. It's set in 1880 Scotland in part because the story involves these two timelines that are running next to each other and yet are related. But setting it in 1880 Scotland allowed me to delve a lot into the history of Ailsa Craig and into the history of curling.
Was there any, like, what was the historical inspiration that you first came across? Did you like see a Facebook article? Or-
Oh, well, I knew about Ailsa Craig, and the very first thing I did in setting out to write a book was to study that. To learn all about the island and the castle and the lighthouse and the puffins and the curling stones and all of that. Learning all that led me down kind of the rabbit hole of the entire history of curling and how that developed in Scotland and how it was done back in the day and like the passage I read, what the sensibilities around it were. It turns out that it was Protestant ministers in Scotland who really helped curling's popularity, because some people thought it was stupid, it was a waste of time, it was, not something that men in particular should be engaging in. They should be working. But Protestant ministers, a lot of them intervened and said, no, this is harmless. It involves great sportsmanship. It's healthy. There's some camaraderie about it. You should let people have their enjoyment and relaxation and fellowship together. And so with the approval of most clergy in Scotland, the game took off.
What who's the character in Scotland? Is there one character in particular?
I'm not sure I can tell you that. Yeah, it's difficult to talk much about the individual characters because
Okay.
the story weaves them together. Yeah. But one fictional character was serving as a lighthouse keeper on Ailsa Craig.
And another question about just the writing process. Did you intend for it to be a mystery when you first decided you were going to write a book?
I wasn't really sure, but as the story started unfolding, my experience was that the characters start to write themselves and the story starts to write itself. You know who the characters are. You have an idea of what they're going to do and how they intersect. But my experience in writing was that the story starts to tell itself. I saw a review once of a novel where the reviewer said, it felt like the author made it up as she went along. And I said, duh. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what happened. So, yeah, I think in my experience, knowing kind of what I wanted the story to be, it starts to tell its own tale and take on a life of its own.
I feel like you could write another book.
I don't know about that one. one may be enough. It's a bit of a slog and it's pretty solitary work. But I wanted to see if I could do it. I wanted to see if I could tell an 80,000 word story.
When did you start the process?
What is it? December? About a year and a half ago. I think it was in April of last year that I actually started writing. And I knew for this particular genre, I had to get to about 80,000 words to fit within kind of industry standards. After about 3 weeks, I finally did a word count and I was at like 2,200 words. I'm like, oh, I have to add some meat to this story. So yeah, it took off after that.
What were some of your methods of research? Did you read like online archives?
It is absolutely amazing what you can find online. If you dig deep enough, you can find entire books, and people have bothered to put their 1782 curling club minutes online. But there is one database from Scotland that Scottish Curling, which is the governing body for the sport in Scotland, has maintained that every known historic curling site anywhere in the country is pinned to a map. And there are some 2,700 sites, old curling ponds, old quarries, old manufacturers, sites of bonspiels. But for every one, if you click on the pin, it links you to all the source documents. So that's where I'm reading all these Scottish newspaper accounts of curling matches from 1770 and from 1840 and what happened there. So that was a big help in the history part. But I guess like most authors doing this kind of a novel, I might read an entire book, and one book was called Stargazing by Peter Hill, who actually served as an apprentice lighthouse keeper on Ailsa Craig. You might read the entire book just to get one little nugget that you can use. And from Peter Hill's experience in Ailsa Craig, they used to have 2 giant iron foghorns, taller than a person. They still exist, they're not used. But they sounded every 45 seconds in 3-second bursts. And the people on the mainland in Scotland, 10 miles away, always complained about the noise, how loud these foghorns were. But Peter Hill, in his book, describes how you had to learn to have a conversation in 45-second spurts, knowing that you're going to get interrupted by the foghorn. So he describes this whole rhythm of learning to talk on an island with lighthouse and foghorns.
So he was one of the lighthouse keepers?
He was one of the lighthouse keepers one summer as a summer job.
It's quite a summer job.
Not bad, actually, I wouldn't think.
Oh, one question soon. Why did you start curling?
When I retired to Maine, I quickly learned that the winters are long and dark. And so curling in the winter on a weeknight or on a Sunday night got me out of the house. It was something to do in the 16-hour stretches of darkness, and helps to break up the winter. And like everyone else, I had seen it on TV and thought I could be great at it. Found out that I couldn't be, but love it. And the fellowship and the camaraderie and the tradition of the winning team buying a beer for the losing team helps too.
So at the Pine Tree Curling Club, which you're a part of, do you compete against people from other curling clubs?
No, it's all intramural teams within the club, but some of the teams will travel around New England and go to bonspiels and play against teams from largely other clubs in New England and Canada. Belfast has a lot of bonspiels. I'm playing in the mixed seniors bonspiel next month. Probably not going to become national champions, but we're hoping to win a game at least.
Oh, we have a comment. On a wonderful trip around Scotland in 2018, I was on the ferry heading to Oban, and sailed past Ailsa Craig. Being from Belfast, it was so interesting to see where curling stones came from. It's in a beautiful area on the west coast of Scotland. I am now looking forward to reading your book.
Oh, well, thank you. On a clear day, you can see all the way down to Northern Ireland from the top Ailsa Craig.
Could you get to the top of it? Like, could you hike to the top?
Yes, yeah. And again, if you read the book, you'll see that that's possible.
Okay. Well, I look forward to reading the book.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.